Everyone, welcome to the third in our Good Ancestors series. Today we have two folks who are going to talk to us about legacy and ancestry and how that can help us think about our generosity and put that in a perspective for not just today, but for future generations. Um, would love to invite everyone right now who is joining us to go ahead, introduce yourself in the chat if you want to. Let us know who you are, where you're joining from, and what you're going to be for Halloween. So let us know, and I will just do a little bit of quick housekeeping right now. For anybody who needs to switch languages, we do have translation today. So you can go to where at the bottom of the panel it says interpretation, and there's a little globe icon. And if you go in there, it'll ask you what language you want to listen in. If you do need to access translation, then you have to pick the language that you need, because otherwise you're just hearing the original audio and you'll hear all of the different languages that everyone is speaking today. All right. As folks are filtering in, please continue to say hello and where you're joining us from and what you're going to be for Halloween. And while you all do that, we will go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Hilda Vega. I work with HIP. I'm the VP of Philanthropic Practice. And today for our Good Ancestors conversation about legacy, ancestry, and philanthropy will be focused on Day of the Dead, which is the image that I have in the background, the altar that we put up for Day of the Dead. Not the one I do, because this is very fancy. But we will be talking about how all of these pieces fit together in our everyday practice. We will have Tameka Vasquez, who is a futurist, guiding us through the session. But first of all, we're going to hear from my colega, Andrea Villaseñor de la Vega, who is part of our team based out of Mexico. She leads up our migration and climate mobility work, and she's going to share with us what Dia de los Muertos means to her. So, Andrea, take it away. I'll let everybody know Andrea will be speaking today in Spanish. So, for folks who need to, please go ahead and access the interpretation right now. Thank you. Andrea.
Hola, muchas gracias. Buenos días, buenas tardes. Welcome. Se supone que también iba a hablar en inglés, pero bueno, creo que estos temas que construyen también, ¿no? Comunidad, era como el poder hacerlo también en, ¿no? En mi idioma, ¿no? Y el poder como transmitir lo que para mí significa. Entonces, bueno, quería primero compartir un poco qué es lo que significa también, pues no solo el Día de Muertos, sino también el Día de Muertos como un ritual o una representación de algo que es más amplio, ¿no? Y desde ahí también quería compartir. Bueno, yo, como decía Hilda, yo soy mexicana, vivo en México. ¿No? En México, pero no solo México, sino otros, ¿no? Otros pueblos también con distintas tradiciones, yo creo que es global, ¿no? Em, pues tenemos esta tradición de nuestros pueblos, de los pueblos indígenas. Y aunque ¿no? a través a partir de la colonia también ha habido todos estos procesos en realidad del sincretismo, seguimos de distintas formas, continuamos sosteniendo nuestras creencias. Y una de estas creencias tiene que ver y está relacionada con el Día de Muertos. Y es más profundo, como decía, ¿no? En los pueblos, para los pueblos indígenas, el hablar, la ancestralidad es uno de sus principios. Entonces, el pensar en los ancestros es esa conexión con su pasado y sobre todo, que eso es lo que me parece más bonito, con su memoria. Esta conexión con los ancestros, también con las personas mayores, con sus abuelos, las abuelas, es la parte de la memoria, porque es de donde viene este legado, el legado de la cultura, el legado de la identidad, el legado de los territorios, de la relación con el territorio, de la relación con un idioma, de los conocimientos, de las tradiciones y también, ¿no? De estos sistemas propios, que son estas formas de la colectividad, de resolver las cosas en la comunidad, de resolver, ¿no? Las situaciones en lo colectivo. Entonces, este vínculo tan importante con los ancestros, por eso es uno de los principios, es lo que también hace y sigue manteniendo pues esta construcción de identidad y esta construcción también de la comunidad y de lo colectivo, es lo que lo sigue también, ¿no? Alimentando. Entonces, también creo que es importante entender que para los pueblos indígenas y para, ¿no? Otras personas que a lo mejor ya somos más fruto quizás de este sincretismo, pues la muerte es entendida como una trascendencia, ¿no? El cuerpo muere, pero el espíritu no muere. Por eso, el cómo mantener, cómo continuar esta conexión con los ancestros, ¿no? Que trascendieron, que ya no están. Esta relación, ¿no? Se mantiene mucho desde esta idea, ¿no? De poder conectar, ¿no? ¿No? En distintos momentos. Una es a través de los sueños, ¿no? El poder también, ¿no? Soñar y traer también a nuestros sueños, ¿no? El otro día hablábamos de quién se acordaba de los sueños. Yo a veces no me acuerdo, ¿no? Pero yo cuando sueño, ¿no? Con mi abuelita materna, que para mí es, ¿no? Y ahora les cuento más, pero para mí es, ¿no? Una de mis ancestras, ¿no? Que me enseña y me guía. Sí recuerdo, ¿no? Los sueños. Cuando sueño con ella, siempre es un sueño que recuerdo. Entonces eso nos ayuda, ¿no? Nos ayuda a seguir, ¿no? Manteniendo como esa conexión y esta, ¿no? Y esta relación, pues sí, en distintas dimensiones. Y por ejemplo, para la cosmovisión maya, ¿no? Que a mí me gusta mucho y siento, ¿no? Que siento, la siento también como pues parte de, ¿no? De esta tradición en la que vivo. La cosmovisión maya se rigen por un calendario de 20 días. Y el noveno día del calendario representa, ¿no? Es el día dedicado o el que representa o el que está asociado a a la muerte. A la muerte, pero también en el sentido de transformación y de renacimiento, ¿no? Que a mí esto es lo que me gusta también mucho de esa cosmovisión maya, ¿no? Que es en un ciclo de 20 días, en el noveno, es el día en el que el queme, ¿no? Es el día en el que el queme se celebra, ese día es el momento en el que también desde la cosmovisión maya y desde la práctica también, ¿no? Desde la vivencia de esta cosmovisión, ese es el día en el que también especialmente se honra a los ancestros y es un día especial en el que se comunican. Me parece lindo porque no es, ¿no? No es solo como un día, ¿no? Un día al año, sino que cada, ¿no? Pues cada 20 días, en el noveno día del calendario, es ese momento de volver, ¿no? De volver a recordar. Y Keme tiene también una representación. Tiene una representación o lo que ¿no? Lo que le llaman el nahual, y el nahual a lo que está asociado es al tecolote, ¿no? O al búho. Y el búho también tiene esta representación de que es un ave que es sabia, que es silenciosa, ¿no? Pues silenciosa como muchas veces también, ¿no? Como la muerte, la transformación y el renacimiento. Entonces, ese día, el quema es ese día para honrar a los ancestros. Pero luego están estos otros rituales, ¿no? Estos otros rituales, pues como el Día de Muertos, ¿no? Lo que nos mantiene también de esta tradición. Y el Día de Muertos, y a ver si soy capaz, ¿no? Y bueno, el Día de Muertos lo que se representa, ¿no? Es un ritual, que es un ritual que no lo llevamos a través, y no, su representación es el altar. Les voy a compartir una foto y ya con esto muy rápido termino para darle paso también a Tameka. Pero bueno, un poco el compartir, ¿no? Este es el altar de muertos. Bueno, hoy no me ha dado tiempo todavía de poner el de este año, pero les comparto el del año, ¿no? El del año pasado. Este es, ¿no? Es un altar chiquito, porque bueno, es un espacio pequeño, pero quería también como compartir por qué y en qué momento para mí fue importante, ¿no? El Día de Muertos, pues hay familias en las que se sigue esta tradición, ¿no? Del altar de muertos y otras en las que no. Pues yo crecí en un hogar católico en el que sobre todo, pues, ¿no? Recordamos a los muertos, pero de una manera distinta, ¿no? Y para mí cuando murió mi abuela, ¿no? Mi abuela materna, ¿no? Que yo le decía bolita, cuando murió mi bolita, Pues para mí fue un día, sí fue un antes y un después, ¿no? Y me emociono y perdón porque esto no estaba previsto. Y para mí fue como, es el momento, ¿no? Es el momento de seguir esa conexión con ella, perdón. Y eso, entonces, bueno, mi abuelita se ve por ahí en una foto y para mí con ella fue esa representación, ¿no? Sí con muchas cosas, ¿no? Con muchas cosas de su legado, pero sí también con un momento especial, ¿no? Un momento de ritual, de especialmente recordar, ¿no? Y recordar las cosas que yo he aprendido de ella y las cosas que quiero seguir manteniendo, ¿no? En mi vida. Ay, perdón, ¿eh? Entonces, creo, ¿no? Que es lo que para mí, ¿no? Y también vinculado con lo que vamos a hablar ahora con Tameka, tiene que ver, ¿no? Con lo que yo quiero también mantener de la tradición de lo que ella me ha enseñado, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cómo lo traigo? Y a mí mi abuelita me enseñó muchas cosas, me enseñó, creo que mucha fortaleza, mucha generosidad, ¿no? Creo que la empatía, ¿no? Yo siempre digo, ¿dónde se aprende la empatía? Pues yo creo que mucha empatía la aprendí de ella, ¿no? Y creo que el construir comunidad, y construir comunidad no solo en la familia, sino el construir comunidad en un sentido mucho más amplio. Y como yo me imagino, ¿no? Y en este momento del ritual, ¿no? También por eso tan emocional, porque creo que es el momento especial de volver a recordar. Creo que es también lo que quiero, ¿no? Lo que yo me imagino de lo que quiero de futuro, ¿no? De cómo me imagino también mis relaciones, pero no solamente las relaciones personales, que también, ¿no? Porque es en el trabajo. Entonces, también cómo vincular, ¿no? Los proyectos, las luchas, cómo vincularlas a esto, ¿no? Que yo he aprendido de ella como una de mis ancestras. El altar ha crecido, ¿no? Ahora hay más gente en el altar, pero creo que también hay más gente de la que aprendemos. Ahora, ¿no? El altar es compartido ¿no? Con Javi, mi esposo, mi compañero, que él creció en otra tradición, pero al final también para él lo ha abrazado, porque creo que aunque él venga de otra tradición también, creo que abrazamos, ¿no? Abrazamos la importancia de los ancestros y de lo que queremos y de lo que proyectamos para nuestra vida, nuestro futuro y para quienes, ¿no? Y eso, también el legado que queremos, ¿no? El legado que queremos ser. Bueno, lo dejo ahí, perdón que me extendí un poquito más, con las lagrimitas incluidas, pero bueno, gracias a todas y todos por la escucha.
Andrea, thank you so much for sharing that. Don't apologize for getting emotional. There's a reason that my altar with my mom is not on screen. Um, but I think it's so important. Obviously, many of the things that you brought up, but it's making me think of a conversation I had this morning with a friend of mine who's Colombian, and she was asking me how do we do an altar because her father passed away a few years ago, and she wanted to do something that honored him, honored other people in her family, but also for something that her daughters could see and could have there as also something for them to look at, to think about, and to have a ritual and a practice with that. And so sometimes people ask me why I consider this conversation part of a philanthropic conversation. Um, and for me, especially this year, when I think about ritual and when I think about history and when I think about what that means for our people, for people of color, but in particular, for Latinas in the U.S. right now, I am thinking about the fact that it is being criminalized and erased, and so it felt doubly important to have a conversation about ritual and practice and our cultures and our ceremonies, and how do we keep that going as a form of resistance, and also to remember our power and where it comes from and how we can continue to tap into that. And I'm here in Chicago, and so this is a place where folks are seeing all kinds of images of our communities and trying to portray a certain narrative of what our community is like. And it's important to be able to show the many, many aspects and elements of our history and our culture and the things that we've done and the things that we will continue to do and to build over time. And so I wanted to just provide a little bit of context between this time with Andrea and with Tameka to help folks center why this conversation is so important to us, for me, but also with HIP right now in terms of thinking about legacy and generosity and where our values come from. So, with that, I will pass it over to Tameka Vasquez, who joined us last year and was a wonderful facilitator for our Day of the Dead conversation. So, wanted to have her back. Thank you.
Thank you all. And thank you, Andrea. That was absolutely beautiful to start us off. I really appreciate the connection to your grandmother because so much of what I have to share with you all is connected to a very similar shared history. I want to keep this as a conversation. I have a number of questions to ask you all, but I'll try to pace through them so you have an opportunity to reflect whether you want to do so in the chat or whether you want to do so privately, both are totally fine, but I would certainly welcome your inputs on some of these thoughts. This conversation is really centered on being a good ancestor and the idea that we can make possibilities happen in a world even if we do not inhabit it. And so the line of thinking that inspires a lot of my work as a futurist and as a strategist is this theme, this idea of a future that's worth inheriting. The reason I use language like that is because it really disrupts the model that the only thing that we can leave for our future descendants is money, right? Because so much of the wealth that was created, that was passed down through generations outside of the capitalist system, was a wealth of knowledge. It was a wealth of love, of compassion, of grit, and a wealth of artifacts. So, how can future generations inherit a world that works better in more ways for more people? This is the question I ask myself, because I think somewhere along the way, Western culture has narrowed this concept of inheritance down to something that you leave behind so that your descendants don't have to deal with the world as it is, right? So we could stockpile money, we could build trust funds, we can create all of these financial buffers so that the people we love could be insulated from this mess, right? But that's not an inheritance, that's actually evasion. That's avoiding the world as it is. And I believe that real inheritance comes from not this illusion of opting out. I think that many of us are in sectors that are making money move literally through a series of these kinds of layers. But what I want to encourage all of us to think about is let's make sure it also moves to empower the formation of a new world, right? How can we make it move in ways that mobilize the energy and the resources and the power that we need to create a new world, to use capital almost like a design tool? So, the question becomes if the greatest inheritance we could leave is not money, right? What could it be? What if it's a practice? What if it's the capacity to just imagine and build differently? In many ways, I think the future that's worth inheriting is the kind of life you wish we were collectively living right now. Anything less is unsatisfactory. I think that it means that, the inheritance isn't something that sort of is collected at the end of our life, right? It's something that is part of our everyday life. It's something we can enact every day. And that practice in some ways has a name. In Future's work we call it world building. So practices like world building are really, they have different frameworks, they have different approaches, and sometimes we think of them as these lofty thought exercises that are not really grounded in the right here right now. But in many ways, world building is meant to be a way to apply the consciousness of the world that we have right now, and then a way to help move towards something else, right? Maybe we could develop a blueprint. Maybe we could develop some artifacts, something that we can leave behind. So we have our own approach, and we've tested this. A few collaborators and we've tested this a few different ways, but the one way I want to share with you all is back in January of this year, 18 degrees in Minneapolis. And we sat in a room with 40 other people and we were testing this idea. We partnered with Aspen Institute and we were testing this idea of what it meant to be a citizen, what it meant to have some kind of shared identity. And what would it mean to design something, a new world for that sense of shared identity and that sense of shared citizenship? And so we had this framework where we talked about governance, how would we govern? How would we create shared spaces? What would we be celebrating? What are ways that people might work or contribute to this world that we are designing? And I think what was so interesting for us was how quickly people get caught up in what are the things, right? What are we going to have? Where are we going to put these things? And in this particular exercise, what I realized was missing was a conversation about who do we actually have to become. So as I'm talking about this concept for the next few minutes, I invite you all to think about that. For the worlds that we are designing, for the things that we may have, who do we actually have to become? Think what I've come to understand is that world building often assumes that we're creating something totally new, something that's never existed before. But some of the most powerful world building to me is actually grounded in remembrance. It's grounded in wisdom. It's really trying to think about what was there before it was forcibly removed. What were the things that sustained our civilizations throughout history? How did our people move through the world? How did they experience being a human being with all of the different cultures that we come from? And so we can't account for every single person. Many of us do not necessarily know all our ancestors. We may not have a clear understanding of what their lives might have looked like. But in many ways, what we do have are these stories that are passed down. We have relics of our cultures, of our histories that we've come to understand through these shared moments of remembrance, through celebration, right? Through moments like Dia de los Muertos. Opportunities like that give us a chance to understand what we can carry forward as we think about the worlds that we want to design. I think a lot about world building as what made my life possible. And I invite you, if that's something you can relate to share. If world building is part of what made your life possible, right? My ancestors are indigenous people, African people, South Asian people who were forcibly removed, displaced, and were forced to contend with new lands, new people, new doctrine, new everything. And they were all placed in this little country in South America, in Guyana. And, they weren't sitting around in brightly lit conference rooms. They didn't have the opportunity to pontificate, right? They couldn't really sit and think about these things as a fanciful thought exercise because they were trying to survive. And so what they really had to do was put their hands in the dirt and get to work. They had to really think about what they're hopeful for. What is a possibility beyond themselves that their children and their descendants would be able to inherit? What would be worth the fight? What would be worth their life? So, in a way, I romanticize it because I think that that couldn't come without some struggle or without bloodshed, but it was done in service of me, right? So before I was even thought of, in a way, I was deeply loved. Before you were even thought of, in a way, you were deeply loved because people loved us enough to deal with the violence and the colonization and the erasure. So they were world building for us. So maybe let's take a moment and think about who were the people that were world building for you. I think a lot about this concept of, in a way, like an apocalypse. I recognize that even though I romanticize world building, I can think about it and write about it and practice it in many different ways. And I romanticize it because I do think it's a very beautiful concept. But I also acknowledge that it didn't come without some kind of apocalypse, some kind of world breaking apart. And in so many ways, I think what's breaking apart right now is an opportunity that we have for collective world building, even if, we think we're alone and we think that all of these things that are happening are almost inevitable. It feels like the future is being handed to us, right? But there are many different worlds. There are many different futures. There are many different versions of that. And so we have to be mindful of, what is the version that we're subscribing to? What is the version that we are fixating our mind on that we think is inevitable? Or what is the version that we are opting in every day to design for? It's interesting because there's a bit of this like subconscious culture, this prepper culture going on right now where the word apocalypse gets thrown around so much. And sometimes, we say it jokingly, but sometimes you can feel that it feels serious for people, that people might feel afraid or they might even be checked out. So I like to look at what is the origination of language that we use. And the word apocalypse actually comes from a Greek word that means an uncovering. It means a revelation, a lifting of the veil. So for you, what is being uncovered right now? Right? And I think that way, when you think about what is being uncovered right now, it allows you to be less afraid in a way of the world as we know it dying. Because in so many ways, what's dying are the things that can no longer be hidden. They can no longer be suppressed. It can't be erased any longer. So many things are coming to the surface. So the silencing or the erasure or the pretending it's not there, that's dying, right? And the veil is being lifted on systems that were built on extraction and they were pretending to be prosperity, right? Or the veil might be lifted on this mythology that we can have endless growth on a finite planet, right? In some ways, the veil is being lifted on this lie that some people are just less worthy or they're just disposable so that other people can thrive, like this either or, this othering. Those are all lies. And so the veil is being lifted on this illusion that we are separate from each other, that we're separate from the earth, and that the future is inevitable. And I think in the midst of that all, even though there is a grieving process that comes with that, but at the same time, I think what's being revealed is human potential, the capacity that we have and we've always had to think differently, to show up differently, to value different things, to unlock a new way of being that might not necessarily pay off in like a quarterly earnings report. Most of my clients are in the private sector, so I say that I say that in many ways, most of it is not going to pay off immediately, but they will reveal themselves across generations. So when I talk about these things sometimes, depending on the audience, some people might perceive it as quite radical, but for me, what's interesting is the word radical itself actually means root. So being radical is not about being extreme. When you talk about world building as this radical concept, it's actually not about being extreme at all. It's about getting down to the root, getting down to the foundation, the things that feel essential to us, right? So I'd encourage you to be radical because that simply means you're returning to your own roots, And so to be radical in apocalyptic times means that while this veil is being lifted, while all of these things are being revealed, you're returning to your roots and you're digging into the truths that you've long held. So when we think about that, as we dig into our roots, our ancestry, what might we find? What might we find? Like, what are the dreams that we might discover that were never fully actualized, right? And how might we return to our world building with some of those ideas in mind? So I think about where we are in this world of slop, for lack of a better word. There's so much of everything. And I think it's creating this collective brain fog because we so quickly habituate to the ways that we're being told to live in the world. And in many ways, I think some of us might experience a bit of a memory loss, like we forget who we are, why we are, whose we are. And so, in a way, remembering is in and of itself an act of resistance. So that's why when Andrea was crying, I almost started crying because I know how important it is to have these recollections, to have these memories. So even though it makes us emotional, that in and of itself is grounded in the belief that it matters and that it is a part of our resistance in this time where it feels like so much is being taken from us. So our memories are the things that are meant to hold on to those stories, those insights, that wisdom, the funny things, the serious things, all of it matters right now. And I think coming to our respective altars, coming to the spaces that we occupy at work and in other spaces with the history that we carry and sitting with the meaning that they hold even now, that is an act of resistance. I think that is a core aspect of what we're talking about in this concept of world building. So, what will you never forget, right? We're oftentimes told what not to forget, but what would you individually never forget? So I mentioned grief very briefly, and I want to acknowledge and hold a little bit more space for that because I think where we are now, it is a paradox. There is this confusion where being in the midst of grieving what is lost, we are also able to tend to what is emerging, and that might be hard to sit with. It's hard to sit with that tension or that it feels almost conflicting. But as we all know through nature, through death there is always life. And so as things are being lost and as things are being removed, we have to contend with that. We have to sit with that. We have to process the grief of that. And we also have to make space for what else might be, right? And I think that's why, a lot of futurists and a lot of activists and movement leaders, they talk about how critical it is to hold imagination, particularly in times like this. And, I think we need to recognize that imagination and creativity and design of futures, it might appear to be a privilege, and a lot of people can be very dismissive of it as a privilege, but it is, in fact, a necessity. And it is also our birthright. We don't have to wait until everything is perfect, our basic needs are met, we're safe and we're comfortable, and then we dream, right? It is a collective necessity to be dreaming all along. Because the people that built this world on extraction or hierarchy or disposability, they never stop designing, right? They're designing right now. They're designing their bunkers and the laws and the systems of control. So if we abandon the work of imagination and we abandon the work of world building, we actually concede the future to them entirely. We concede or we relinquish our power entirely. So to the extent that my existence or our existence is already an act of world building, the legacy of our ancestors is our life, right? Every day I live in a body that was supposed to be impossible. I'm speaking truths that were supposed to stay silent, right? I get to be part of this community that, in many ways, that was supposed to be illegal, right? And we get to imagine futures that are supposed to be unthinkable. And that is not a privilege. That is very core to our survival. So, as a final thought, I live by this phrase. Hilda and others have heard me say this phrase many times, but I hold on to what science fiction writer Octavia Butler once beautifully said, um, which is that there is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. And I think about that a lot. The ancient elements that we've always had, the root, the seed, the soil, the water, our breath, our body, our stories, this community, rituals, resistance, joy, all these things that we talked about, these are nothing new. We don't have to invent something completely new, right? These things are older than any system that has been trying to control them. But we can create new suns, right? We can look at the configuration of all of these things in the creation of new worlds. And that, in and of itself, I believe, can be our legacy. So I'll leave that for now and would love to hear how folks are thinking and processing and feeling.
Tameka, that was so amazing and powerful. And you're just always such a thoughtful, provocative speaker. So I'm so glad that you could join us again this year. Let's see. We do have one question in the Q&A. So let's see. I'll read the whole thing aloud unless you want to do that, Tameka, but I can go ahead and read it. My lived experience as a formerly undocumented person and the example of generosity that my grandparents set for me are what drive my work in philanthropy. But I often struggle with how white, transactional, and at times empty philanthropy can feel, especially in planned giving. I really believe in this work, but I also find myself getting jaded when those values don't align. How do you personally stay grounded and connected to purpose in this kind of environment without burning out or losing hope? She adds, this webinar has been really helpful in helping me reground, but I'd love practical advice or practices for sustaining that sense of purpose day to day. So Tamika, do you want to start off, and then Andrea, I'll invite you to think about a response to.
Yeah, I certainly have to sit with that for a while, but the way I've been trying to ground myself is focusing less on the what and more on the how. So, how I show up day to day, how I engage with people, how I use language, how I refuse to feed into narratives that are harmful, right? How I show up every day and do that work is just as impactful and has just as much of a ripple effect, I would argue, as the what, right? Because we are working within very constrained systems. I mean, we're not going to be able to just unplug them all overnight. I wish we could. But it is so critical and important to remember that while we are doing the work of upending systems that have been around for centuries at this point, particularly here in Western history, it's these are not going to be overnight exercises, but the small shifts matter too. And the things that feel incremental and they feel almost too slow to be impactful, they actually matter quite a lot. So I think of the metaphor that I use in my work that I try to keep in mind is a metaphor of tectonic plates, right? So the earth is always moving. We don't feel it. It's always moving. So the only time we feel it is when those tectonic plates start to shift to the point where it's an earthquake and then it's urgent and then it's an emergency, right? So that's when we react. That's when we feel like, oh, something's happening. But things are happening the whole time and we don't always feel it. So don't take for granted the things that you are doing that are not immediately felt, but they certainly do have a ripple effect.
Thank you, Tamika. Andrea, do you want to comment?
Yeah. No, thank you, Tameka. This is incredible. I will say that no, I'm about the comments and the questions. I'm thinking on the yes, and the sense of purpose and no and linked what Tameka was saying. For me, I used to say, and being also in philanthropy, I used to say that let's put the important things, the things that matter in the center of the conversation, no? And thinking on, no, and sometimes the center of the conversations in philanthropy, it's only about the money. But let's try to shift the narrative because the conversation has to be no on the purpose that we have no and for example for me uh, part of my purpose is with the immigrant community, so let's talk about no on that is the what no that is the important, and then no let's figure it out how, and let's figure out no the rest of the no the rest of the things that help us to continue building non-continuous, not building, like, bueno, building, no, in this perspective that you were mentioned, Temeka, no, the building, no, the world that we want, the world building, no, that we wanted with the, no, with the people on the center. And then, no, and this is something that not some of the provocation that you make and the questions that you made, it is also for me related with the, no, how this is related with the community, and the answer is in community. It's not only, no, it's not only me, no, trying to be a world building. It is, but it's not only that. It makes sense because it's in the community. So I think that also that this continue question what the community means for me, from also from the legacy, from the things that I learn, for the things that I continue learning, so how that I can contribute, to continue in this perspective of building community. And I think that's the challenge, that things that how do we can continue, because community is not only like being the same space, no, it's like being connected and be with the purpose, and being also respectful of the differences, and in those differences, no, we are contributing, no, we are building also, no, from our difference too. But it's not only to the community is not only to be in the same space, no, it's this connection, no, that we have.
Thank you, Andrea. And I'll also comment on that question because I for many years have worked as a philanthropic advisor. So that's a lot of work with individual donors, and in many respects is considered a space where, as an advisor, we're supposed to be agnostic about the issues. And I think that that's changing. I think that being agnostic isn't going to work anymore because we've been agnostic for however many years. It's not working. That's not the solution. But something that I think about a lot is that question that floats around of how can I be useless to capitalism today? So, what are little things I can do every day to just not participate in the system the way that I'm expected to participate? Or, where do I just drop little hints and little ideas for the donors I'm working with? The one or two little organizations, and try to just sort of filter in that way, because it is, a lot of these little actions and a lot of these little considerations that will start, I think, shifting different patterns of behavior. So, we have to live with that tension, but it doesn't mean that we have to ignore what it prompts in us. There's little things that we can do, and there's little things that we can say to be able to feel like we are aligned ourselves with the work that we are doing, and that we're increasingly kind of moving how we approach the work and the ways that we talk about the work to be how we want to be in the world fully. And I also say this with, a few years of experience under my belt. And, I had a milestone birthday this year where, I'm just going to say the things I'm going to say, and it's going to be what it's going to be. Not everyone's in that position, but it's been working just fine for me. So, folks, we are basically at time. We just have a minute. So, Tameka or Andrea, if you have a closing word or some closing thoughts, we have a minute if you want to share something before we wrap up. Either one of you.
Well, I will always say thank you for holding space and time in your hearts and in your minds in the midst of a crazy work day, I'm sure, for many of you, and just a crazy time for us collectively. So thank you for considering new ways of thinking, new lenses. Thank you for sitting with the questions, and hopefully these conversations keep going.
Thank you, Tameka. No, and I think that it's like the same. No, it's like uh, we have to learn in a different ways. No, we have to, I don't know, desaprender. No, we have to
To unlearn.
change. Yeah, unlearn and yes, unlearn. And I think that not these spaces and thank you, Tameka, because this is it. No, and thank you, Hilda, no, for always play the magic on all these things. And I think that it's yes, no, give us like the opportunity, no, to calm down, to rethink, and that's why, the rituals are important. And maybe, if you have 5 minutes after this conversation, I think that it's important just to, no, live it and try to feel it. No, try to live it in your, no, in your body. And thank you for the openness, no, and different ways of thinking. And I think that there's where's the answer, and the clue to continue building community, continue building collaboration. And thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you both for joining us today. Thanks to everyone who joined the webinar. As we go into next week, which is really an entire week of remembrance, and when the veil is a little bit thinner between all of our worlds, I just want to encourage everyone to think about what these practices mean to you, and the ways that you can create new ones and construct new ones, and think about your role in world building. We will have another final of the year Good Ancestor conversation in November, so please be on the lookout for that. Please also fill out the poll that you will see at the end of the webinar so that we know how we can keep shaping conversations like this for everyone. So thanks, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Bye.